On this channel, I want to occasionally look at contemporary thoughts and key ideas, not just historical fragments. So today I'm going to put together a couple of contemporary ideas which can be enlightening not only on their own, but in combination with one another. There are two things I will look at in this video. The first comes from a lecture by Professor John Mearsheimer called The False Promise of Liberal Hegemony. A link can be found in the description below. Now, Mearsheimer is a professor at the University of Chicago. His focus is international relations. He's part of a realist school of thought on international relations. This speech was the second of three that he delivered at Yale University on the topic of liberal dreams versus political realities. And the speech is useful because it contains a good and, I think, largely accurate view of how the United States and the liberal democratic world more broadly see itself in relation to the rest of the world. I'll summarize his arguments. Mearsheimer talks about something he calls liberal hegemony and what that is, when states pursue it, what it looks like in practice, and why he believes it is doomed to failure as a policy. I'll also suggest a couple of extensions to his analysis, specifically how we can apply his observations beyond just foreign relations and into domestic policy, and the implications of what one might call postmodern developments in the liberal West. First, liberal hegemony, as Mearsheimer defines it, is essentially the aim of turning every nation in the world into a liberal democracy. It is, in Mearsheimer's view, the more or less declared foreign policy of the United States since the end of the Cold War. It is a policy beloved by the American foreign policy establishment and by American elites, regardless of their political affiliation. It is pursued by Democrats and Republicans alike, as we've seen through Clinton, Bush, Obama. Donald Trump, he does cite as an exception to this. But the response of the foreign policy establishment to Donald Trump is also fairly well documented at this point, and that response does seem to suggest that his opposition to this policy was one reason why they opposed him so heavily. And if you ever wondered why liberals and conservatives in America seem to enact such similar foreign policies, this is why. Because they have the same foreign policy, or largely the same foreign policy. The foundation of the policy of liberal hegemony is liberalism. Now here I'm going to use Mearsheimer's definition, but there is a point at which what we might call a postmodern development is going to alter things. So the foundation of this view is liberalism as a political philosophy. Liberalism, particularly in its American form, emphasizes individualism and inalienable rights. Inalienable rights, as America understands it, apply to everybody and cannot be taken away. This ideology is necessarily universalist for this reason. And when you adopt it, you become consumed with spreading liberal democracy as defined by you across the globe. And the reason why is you do not believe that there is any difference between people. Americans, Iraqis, Chinese, all at bottom are the same person. They have the same individual characters, the same inalienable rights, and therefore they should have the same government. Incidentally, this view is also essentially globalist and not nationalist, because all people are the same. So there is, in principle, no reason other than practical considerations why we couldn't just have one world government, and that world government be a liberal democracy. Now that's my addition. Mearsheimer doesn't say this. He doesn't make this extension to globalism in his video, but it is implied by his analysis, and I think it is also correct. So why does this policy arise? Why do countries seek to spread liberal democracy across the globe? Mearsheimer says it's for three reasons. The first reason is you spread democracy to protect human rights. The idea is that anyone whose rights are threatened, they impose upon us a responsibility to act on their behalf. So I saw a picture of a Canadian member of parliament holding up a sign that said #StandWithUkraine. This is an encapsulation of precisely this view, as Mearsheimer describes it. In fact, this view goes so far in liberal discourse that it is a mainstream opinion that any non-liberal government, for example, Russia, China, Iran, is by definition in a state of aggression with its own people. Professor Michael Doyle of Columbia University is someone who makes precisely this argument, and he is a prominent and mainstream international relations theorist. Now, if this idea doesn't sound all that extreme to you, let me compare it with a very similar theory. And the theory goes, all non-Islamic states are by definition in a state of war with all Islamic states. Therefore, there exists a permanent casus belli for an Islamic state to invade a non-Islamic state for the sake of spreading true religion. Now, this is a mainstream view of international relations according to traditional Islamic thought, an idea that was so well known that Francis Bacon refers to it as a known principle in an early 17th century work called Dialogue Touching on Holy War. Liberal hegemony, like traditional Islam, believes its mission is to spread the true faith around the world. It believes that if every country became a liberal democracy, then problems of human rights would go away. So that's reason one to spread it, you're protecting human rights. And reason two, you spread liberal democracy to establish world peace. A world of democracies would be peaceful because democratic nations do not fight each other, because the people respect the rights of others and are tolerant. So this would solve the problems of things like not only world peace, but nuclear proliferation or terrorism. It's democratic peace theory. This was also the rationale behind invading Iraq. In other words, the invasion of Iraq happened in pursuit of a liberal theory, according to Mearsheimer, based on the assumption that turning Iraq and other Middle Eastern states into liberal democracies would spread peace. Insofar as liberals opposed that, it was not because they disagreed with that view. They disagreed with whether we could practically carry that out, whether we could practically institute liberal democracies or not. They didn't disagree that if they were liberal democracies, it would spread peace. In fact, they agreed with that. This is why some liberals, such as Tony Blair, supported the invasion, because they agreed with the underlying assumption that it would spread peace. It would get rid of the problem of terrorism. In fact, according to this assumption, Al-Qaeda wasn't even really the problem. It was merely part of the problem. The real problem was that states like Iraq, Iran, Syria, Afghanistan were controlled by non-liberal regimes. Reason three for spreading liberal democracy is you do it as a way of protecting the liberal order at home. Every liberal theorist knows that not everyone will accept liberalism, even within liberal states. So, there is always a danger that some group at home will become powerful and attempt to overthrow the liberal order. Quoting Mearsheimer, quote, "And what really scares liberals is the thought that that group on the home front will form an alliance with a foreign country, and that foreign country will help fuel revolution at home," end quote. Now, this last point is worth considering in some depth because it explains, I believe, the enormity of the response, the negative response, to the Trump phenomenon. Recall that the Trump campaign in 2016 was spied on, perhaps illegally, and the possibility of collusion with Russia was a matter of serious concern for years, regardless of any evidence for or against that, and that the intelligence and security communities in the United States did nothing to dissuade anyone from that view. Now, whether Trump himself was actually a liberal or would have overthrown the liberal order, he was certainly seen as a galvanizing figure for forces who would want to do that. And so every step was taken to marginalize Trump as the most illiberal of figures, and this was done not only to affect him and sideline him, but also to associate his movement and anyone who might identify with this movement with moral and political undesirables. Hillary Clinton's basket of deplorables was none other than illiberal or anti-liberal forces operating in the United States. Notice how, even when Trump was out of office, the U.S. government still continues to insist that illiberal forces within the United States constitute the most serious domestic threat, to the extent of referring to these threats as domestic terrorists. This is not unlike the Red Scares that occurred in the United States after World War I and early in the Cold War, because at those points, the illiberal forces that were most dangerous to the United States were the communist forces. Today, however, it is Russia and China, which are seen as the threats. And looked at from the other side, Russia and China are in constant concern that liberal groups and individuals within their countries will work with the U.S. to undermine their regimes. This is why countries like Russia and Belarus take such strong stands against NGOs. It's because they recognize that NGOs exist to promulgate liberalism within their countries. They are not merely welfare organizations. They are there to promote liberal hegemony and are therefore threats to their political regimes. Now here I want to add my first extension of Mearsheimer's theory, which is that liberal hegemony is pursued as a domestic policy, not just a foreign policy, in that within liberal democracies, there is a constant effort to promote and extend liberal and democratic values to achieve progress for this or that disadvantaged group within the society. And consequently, there is also a constant effort to attack or fend off the efforts of alleged illiberal groups. There's constant references to white supremacists, for example, or the KKK, or whatever it might be. One example of this now is the emphasis on structural racism within American society and the insistence that fundamental changes be made to bring more liberalism and more democracy within the state. So progressive liberalism seems to constantly be on the warpath, not only abroad, but at home. There are always illiberal enemies to fight. Mearsheimer's next point is that liberal hegemony cannot be pursued in a multipolar world because states must still be concerned with the logic of balance of power. A multipolar world means a world in which there are a number of countries of roughly equal economic and military might. That was the state of things during the Cold War. The Soviet Union was America's equal or essential equal in economics and military power. But in a unipolar world, such as our world after the fall of the Soviet Union, the United States became the global hegemon and was free to pursue any course that it wanted to. And what the U.S. did was pursued the course that it always wanted to pursue. In other words, liberal hegemony, to transform the world into little copies of itself, or rather of its value system. Now, if you're wondering why the world seems to be spiraling out of control, becoming more and more insane, the end of the Cold War has a lot to do with this. Because since 1989, the United States has pursued liberal hegemony not only as its foreign policy, but also, I would add, as its domestic policy. It is advancing the standard of liberal progressivism with reckless abandon in a way that it could not have done if there was another great power out there in the world that had to be taken into account. Sure, they did advance liberal progressivism even during the Cold War, at home and abroad. They did that, but there were brakes on the train because consideration had to be taken for balancing against the Soviet Union. Now there's no brakes on that train. What does liberal hegemony look like in action? Mearsheimer is an expert in international relations, so he focuses on issues of military and trade. He notes that America has fought 7 separate wars since the Cold War ended and has been fighting someone somewhere in 2 out of every 3 years since 1989. In fact, that percentage is even higher since he gave this speech because combat has continued in several different places. Key to his argument is recognizing that this drive is a liberal drive. Clinton, Bush, Obama, they all pursued this in their own ways. And to this, I would add what I said above. Liberal hegemony is pursued socially and economically. Liberal states use NGOs, the World Bank, the IMF, open trade, and so on to push things in the direction they want. So the insistence that companies use something like an ESG score and that this influence what companies we finance. This is an effort at liberal social engineering that is being pursued, and it's being pursued for the reasons of liberal hegemony that Mearsheimer describes. It's an economic way of pursuing liberal hegemony. And then you could also add that the soft power of culture plays a role. Hollywood plays a role in advancing this standard. Now, Mearsheimer believes the policy of liberal hegemony is doomed for several reasons. One reason is social engineering is difficult at best, and sometimes, and in some cases, impossible. At home, one can see the massive efforts with lots of money behind them to engineer or socially engineer transsexualism into something that is perceived as normal and unproblematic. That is something that it's doubtful how successful it's been, and whatever success it may have requires an enormous amount of propaganda and an enormous amount of money. So it's very difficult. And then abroad, normalizing it abroad is also a very, very difficult thing. Another factor is nationalism is a very powerful force which resists interventions by foreigners. A classic example of this would be Vietnam, where the Vietnamese resistance was not strictly speaking due to communism, but also due to nationalism. The communists in Vietnam were perceived by most Vietnamese, or many Vietnamese, as nationalist forces. They wanted Vietnam to determine its own course in the world. And the American liberal hegemonic intervention failed because it was unable to overcome that nationalist force. Mearsheimer also believes that interest in individual rights is oversold. People do like individual rights generally, but they will also sacrifice rights for stability. They will also sacrifice rights for safety. I would point to the restrictions and mandates of the last couple of years, which have been advanced in the name of public health, as evidence of Mearsheimer's point that individual rights can be oversold. Finally, liberal hegemony is hard to pursue because powerful regional actors will attempt to balance their interests against the world hegemon. And so in regional cases, there will be instances in which regional powers can resist. China is an example. Russia is an example. And to a lesser degree, Iran and North Korea are also examples where the hegemon, despite its overwhelming force, has limited ability in how it can throw its weight around. And in fact, both of the latter countries, Iran and North Korea, are pursuing nuclear weapons as a way of limiting America's capacity to bully them militarily. Now, my question is this. If Mearsheimer is correct about liberal hegemony, which I think he is, in that it does accurately describe the foreign policy pursued by America and its client states abroad, and to some degree, the domestic policy America adopts at home. If he's correct about it, what happens if the world is transitioning to a post-liberal order in which the old liberal values of individualism and human rights don't matter as much anymore? And here I want to turn to our second consideration, which is an article on MEMRI, MEMRI, which is called Russia's New Conservative Ideology to Counter Liberalism, written by Anna Majar-Barducci. From January 11, 2022. Now, this article is responding to a speech by Russian Federation President Vladimir Putin that he made at the Valdai Forum in October 2021. And the Valdai Forum is basically the Russian equivalent of Davos. It's a place where Russian elites gather to talk about political, economic, and cultural issues confronting them. And before quoting from Putin's speech, the author of the article references several key thinkers to provide a background. And by looking at this background, we can take a different view on implications of the policy of liberal hegemony that were described by Mearsheimer. First, the author quotes from Ryszard Legutko, who is a Polish philosopher who isn't actually a supporter of the Kremlin, but he does have a critical viewpoint of Western democracy as practiced currently. Legutko wrote a book called The Demon in Democracy, and the article quotes from his book, where he criticizes both communism and liberal democracy in this way. Quote, "It goes without saying that anything in both communism and liberal democracy should be modern. That means against tradition, thinking, family, school, literature, and philosophy. If a thing, a quality, an attitude, an idea is not modern, it should be modernized, or will end up in the dustbin of history, an unforgettable expression having as much relevance for the communist ideology as for the liberal democratic. This was a reason why the former communists so quickly found allies in liberal democracy. Here, as an aside, I'll note that many of the neoconservatives were originally Trotskyites. So quickly found allies in liberal democracy, where the struggle for progress animates practically every aspect of individual and collective activities. Both systems generate, at least in their official ideological interpretations, a sense of liberation from the old bonds, that is, history. Both want the past eradicated altogether, or at least made powerless as an object of relativizing or derision. Communism, as a system that started history anew, had to be, in essence and in practice, against memory. And I think you're starting to see that in products, cultural products in the liberal democratic world. You're starting to see this rejection of history, or hatred of history, or contextualization, deconstruction of history taking place. To return to Legutko's book, in my country, Poland, at the very moment when communism fell and the liberal democratic order was emerging, memory again became one of the main enemies. The apostles of the new order lost no time in denouncing it as a harmful burden hampering striving for modernity. Now, I'll just offer a few observations related to Legutko's comments. One observation: the popularity among progressive Americans of the phrase, the right side of history. Another, the dismantling of statues that took place in the United States as part of an alleged racial awakening. I'll note that when this took place, statues which were taken down included not only Confederates and slave owners, but the statues of abolitionists, of Abraham Lincoln, of Ulysses S. Grant. Was it a racial awakening, or was there, in some sense, a general hatred of the past? Third, the use of nostalgia or nostalgic as part of criticism of works of art, pieces of music, games, or any other kind of cultural product which strongly evoke the past. This is something I've noted in culture for decades now, and I wondered about it. But what if the root of this suspicion of nostalgia is suspicion of the past, of memory? My channel is in some ways an attempt to resist this, to resist the eradication of memory by strongly insisting upon remembering, and remembering very clearly and thinking through with sympathy our historical forebears. Now let's consider that it is this that liberal hegemony, as defined by Mearsheimer, it is this that liberal hegemony seeks to impose on the world. It's not just democratic elections. It's not just freedom as an abstract category. It's not just individual rights. It is also what Legutko calls a rejection of the past, a rejection of tradition, a rejection of everything that goes into making a people who it is, at least insofar as there's a contradiction of the demands of progressive liberalism. One key example would be religion. Religion in a liberal democratic state must be reduced into something that either agrees with liberal platitudes, such as Jesus wanted to help the poor also. Jesus loved everybody. He would support the welfare state. Everything is reduced into that, or else it is sidelined and marginalized. Now consider that typically in the West, the liberalized churches also have massively declining attendance. It seems that a liberalized religion, at least an explicitly liberalized religion, leads to no religion at all. That is certainly how it seems to Islamic and Orthodox critics of the liberal world. Now let's skip ahead to Putin's speech, as quoted in the article. In this speech, Putin describes what he sees in the United States today. We look in amazement at the processes underway in the countries which have been traditionally looked at as the standard bearers of progress. Of course, the social and cultural shocks that are taking place in the United States and Western Europe are none of our business. We are keeping out of this. Some people in the West believe that an aggressive elimination of entire pages from their own history, reverse discrimination against the majority in the interest of a minority, and the demand to give up the traditional notions of mother, father, family, and even gender. They believe that all of these are the mileposts on the path towards social renewal. Listen, I would like to point out once again that they have a right to do this. We are keeping out of this, but we would like to ask them to keep out of our business as well. Keep out of our business as well. That is a reference, I think, to the foreign policy of liberal hegemony as Mearsheimer describes it. Again, it is not simply a policy of unquestionable eternal values, but a policy that requires, as the Russians see it, as Putin sees it, giving up traditional notions of mother, father, family, and gender. And they don't want to do this. Traditional societies don't want to do this. They reject notions of progress, which see giving up these things as necessary steps. And liberalism is now making these demands in every country where liberalism is accepted. And you're starting to see even liberal countries start to balk at some of these demands. And the ruling order sees this, and they are doubling and tripling down because they can't resist it. If you accept liberal premises, you find it difficult to defend yourself against these demands. And my proof of this is you could probably defend yourself intellectually on an individual basis. Someone like Jordan Peterson can create an island for himself and like-minded people, but he is not going to galvanize a political force that can oppose any of the things that liberalism demands. He has not been successful at resisting their demands. He's been pushed to the margins in official public discourse. Putin goes on to say that Russia rejects this current path of liberalism because the communists in Russia already tried it and the results were disastrous. So he seems to also see the view that Legutko pointed out, that there is something about liberalism and communism that is very similar in how it proceeds. The advocates of so-called social progress believe they are introducing humanity to some kind of new and better consciousness. Godspeed, hoist the flags, as we say, go right ahead. The only thing that I want to say now is that their prescriptions are not new at all. It may come as a surprise to some people, but Russia has been there already. After the 1917 revolution, the Bolsheviks, relying on the dogmas of Marx and Engels, also said that they would change existing ways and customs, and not just political and economic ones, but the very notion of human morality and the foundations of a healthy society, the destruction of age-old values, religion, and relations between people, up to and including the total rejection of family, we had that too, encouragement to inform on loved ones. All this was proclaimed progress, and, by the way, was widely supported around the world back then and was quite fashionable, same as today. By the by, the Bolsheviks were absolutely intolerant of opinions other than theirs. So the author of the article suggests that a new kind of Cold War may be emerging, but one in which America is now on the side of communism. Not communism meaning elimination of private property, but communism as this advancement, this elimination of history and tradition. Communism now having collapsed into liberalism or been absorbed into liberalism. I think this is why many opponents of these forces like to refer to people at the World Economic as communists, even though they explicitly are not communists. They don't see themselves as that. But what they are seeing, what they are responding to, is this kind of similar view of the past, this kind of similar view of overcoming of the past and all tradition. Russia sees itself as standing against this as a conservative force. But when they say conservative, when Putin says conservative, Americans don't hear that because we think of conservative as Ronald Reagan conservatism, which was essentially a kind of liberal conservatism. It accepted liberal democracy. It just was allied with free market forces. The view here, meaning the view of Putin and Legutko and others, is that there were three ideologies competing in the 20th century: liberalism, communism, fascism. The first two combined to defeat the third, then squared off against each other. Liberalism was the winner, but the communists sort of joined forces to some degree with them. Having won the Cold War, the result was not an increase in freedom, but a growing authoritarianism within liberalism itself. That's not what one would expect unless you realize that liberalism was always authoritarian. It merely kept that concealed because, as Mearsheimer argued in his speech, It had to moderate itself as part of the competition among great powers. With that competition removed, liberalism no longer had to moderate itself, and so it could advance, and it could advance as stridently as it wanted, as authoritarian a mode as it wanted. And it is becoming, and probably will become, even more authoritarian. And that means it is intolerant of the opinion of others, as Putin said in his speech. The article cites conservative British commentator John O'Sullivan, the former vice president and executive director of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. O'Sullivan says, liberal democracy has policies and prohibitions built into its ideological structure. It is not really open to institutions and policies that run counter to its liberationist instincts. It increasingly restricts their freedom to maneuver on anything from parental rights to national sovereignty. Just to take a few examples, what becomes of parental rights on trans issues? Why did the U.S. government investigate parents who complained about the use of critical race theory in the classroom? Why have many Democrats made the claim that parents should not have a say in their children's education, a view which they now keep secret as it has possibly cost them an important election or two? Why were British elites so angry about the Brexit vote, to the extent that some said there shouldn't have even been a vote about such a matter? In other words, that we can't leave such decisions to democracy. O'Sullivan goes on to say, it is even hostile to some fundamental values of liberalism, such as free speech. Accordingly, it sometimes comes up against the wishes of voters expressed in elections and referenda. This hostility within liberal elites toward what are often taken as fundamental values of liberalism, that points to a matter which deserves serious thought and reflection. Are liberal democracies moving to a post-liberal ideological order? In other words, an order in which individual rights and democracy are less important than, shall we say, the rights of certain groups or the rule of experts? And what are the implications of a world in which liberal democracies become less bound by concerns of individual rights, less bound by democratic will, less concerned with free expression, and yet they continue to follow the policy, as they seem dedicated to do, the policy of liberal hegemony, as they clearly are continuing to follow it in foreign policy, as the disagreement over the Ukraine showed. What happens when the liberal state pursues liberal hegemony at home and abroad, but is no longer limited by liberalism? This is something we all need to confront.